Hey everyone, I want to just talk a little bit about the phenomenon of OpenAI, something that many people know as ChatGPT. There's been a lot of controversy around this and a lot of discussion about how it might end up being used in classrooms, how it might affect the educational process. Many people are worried that the kinds of questions they give might be answerable by an AI rather than by the student actually thinking about what the best answer might look like for a particular question. And so what I'd like to do today is to just think a little bit about what the most constructive and positive uses of this technology might be within an educational setting in general, and more particularly our classroom, any classroom that I'm a professor in. So here's the thing. There is, since forever, there have been technologies that have affected how pedagogy can proceed, what can actually happen within a classroom, what people value in terms of what ought to be learned in a classroom, and how that might be diminished. During the Middle Ages, the majority of the population was not literate. People spent a lot of times copying out classic texts. The classroom situation was one of what they called disputations, particularly in Paris around the time of Thomas Aquinas. And so what a disputation was a kind of an argument. People would take different sides of the argument, and they would marshal arguments in favor of a position and against it. They would consider opposing arguments and refute them. And much of the graduate level educational process would consist of that kind of what might be called a dialectical interchange. Okay, so this is predicated on the notion that most people don't have texts at hand, or if they do have them, they've probably either copied them out themselves or paid no small amount of money for somebody else to copy them out. There are often what are called scriptoriums, in which they were copied out by monks as an act of devotion. So the point is, it was really hard to get a text. So fast forward, now we get the printing press. Okay, all of a sudden texts are easier to come by. How does that integrate into the classroom setting? Well, for one thing, there is a change in what counts as memory, or what the way that memory integrates into what we might think of as learning. If you are a student in the Middle Ages, memory is hugely important, and so you have to remember a great number of things. You don't have texts at hand for the most part to do that, and so there are many techniques in order to do that. You get a printing press where it's now possible for people to own texts, and that is going to have a direct effect on what is remembered, what ought to be remembered, how memory actually works. And so you can imagine if you're teaching, if you're in charge of a classroom at that time, you might be quite disturbed by this, right? Everything's changing. Now we have to rethink what counts as memory and what's worth remembering. Now I have to change all my lesson plans. Well, and it's true. And, you can look at various technological turns at various points in the West throughout, from that point on, and you can see some of those turns happening elsewhere in the world in other, higher education systems. And you realize that technology has always had an effect, an impact on how we learn in the classroom. Okay, so all of that to say, this is nothing new. Okay. I remember when video started coming on. I worked in a television station in my high school, editing video and producing programs, educational programs. This was a long time ago, back in the 1970s. We were still cutting, literal videotape and splicing it together and all of those sorts of things, long before, nonlinear editing and digital editing, all the rest of that. That all had an effect on what could happen in the classroom. If you have a video of an expert explaining something, that teacher does not have to do that anymore, right? The teacher can now focus on something else. Every time we get a new technology, now we get the internet. What happens then? Well, is education over? Some people thought it would be, right? Some people thought, well, why don't we just scale this thing up? We'll get MOOCs, right? we'll get, the very best professors in the world. They'll teach the courses. Everyone will flock to them. And, there was a lot of discussion about, how education was just going to go down the toilet on a local level, right? Because you had the superstars doing all the courses. And, there's, why would we want teachers anymore when we can have the superstar telling us about something? MOOCs never took off. And I think there are a lot of good reasons for that, right? But the delivery of information on the internet very much did take off, right? I mean, there is a huge amount of stuff out there, and it forces us to rethink how we approach a classroom, okay? What the purpose of a classroom actually is, right? It can't just be about information transfer, because that information is largely available. People talk about YouTube University, for example. If you want to know any practical thing at all, you can probably go to YouTube and find multiple videos on how to do it, right? Lots and lots of videos on the history of this and the nature of that. And, I certainly use YouTube for lots of different things. So does that mean that the classroom is now no longer of any use to us? I don't think so. So something like ChatGPT, I think, is only the latest beat, only the latest moment in that very long discussion about how we think about the interface between technology and what actually happens in a classroom. So the fear, obviously, is that students are, instead of going, thinking about something themselves, they're going to let the AI do the thinking for them, let the AI write out something for them, and there's just going to be a shortcut past thinking at all. It is going to require some rethinking of how we structure assignments, right? If I was just to ask you a question, answer this, and expect you to write that out, well, I've always known that you could just kind of go and plagiarize something from somewhere. I've always known that. Every teacher knows that, right? But now you could do it in such a way that it's not really traceable back to a specific text, right? I mean, if you get the AI to do it, there's no, I've got the smoking gun, it's in this book on this shelf, there it is, copied out, or it's on this website, cut and pasted, there we go, we can find it, right? The AI is going to, not be amenable to that kind of thing. So the question of proving that it was you, the student, who actually did the work, that part becomes harder. But I think there's another way to look at it. What if we look at OpenAI as a kind of tool? Okay, and I'm talking about OpenAI, which is a company with what is currently the most well-known AI for doing this sort of thing, which is ChatGPT. But it's not the only one, and it's not going to be the only one, and it's only going to keep getting better. Let's put it that way. Okay, so now let me show you what I have found on ChatGPT. So I've put in a few things. The first one is, a theory question. I just wanted to see how well it would do on this, and so I asked it, give me a critical theorist's response to a hermeneutical approach to texts. Okay, so at one level, seems like a fairly theoretical question. You have to know what critical theory is, and not just kind of general public's idea of what it is, but what it actually is. You have to know what hermeneutics is, what both of these things have to say about texts. So how did it do? Well, it did pretty well on a basic level. I mean, I asked for a response, and I did not ask for that response necessarily to be critical, but it did give some criticisms of hermeneutic response to texts. The criticisms it gave are pretty standard, let's put it that way, okay? And not necessarily very insightful. The thing about critical theory and hermeneutics is that there's been a long conversation between these two, approaches to theory over the last 100 or so years. And so what we have here, the criticisms that have been given, is number one, that hermeneutics, which is concerned with interpretation, can be too subjective and open to multiple readings. That is a standard criticism of hermeneutics, but it also happens to be a very superficial understanding of what hermeneutics actually is. Okay, it's not just about subjectivism, the great writers in hermeneutics are very, very explicit that they're not arguing for some sort of a subjectivist sort of approach to texts. And, Gadamer talks about that in Truth and Method, and lots of other people do. So at one level, this makes, kind of plausible sense. If you understand the areas, you know that that's already been addressed and answered. It says another possible objection is that hermeneutics can be too focused on the individual reader and their subjective experience rather than considering the social, cultural, and historical context in which texts were produced. Again, legitimate. Okay, a legitimate question raised there. I don't know that it's about the individual reader necessarily. It's about what the people in literary theory call reader reception. So it's not just about one reader's reception. It can be about lots of readers' receptions. Nevertheless, the questions of structure remain, issues. Again, there's lots of back and forth about that between hermeneuticists and critical theorists, and so this is a good, very kind of quick and superficial answer. But if I saw this in a paper, that somebody handed in to me, I would say, okay, come on, you've just barely started the conversation here. What's the response to this? How have hermeneuticists answered this? And so there's a lot more to be said. And so this would be a pretty clear giveaway to me that this was written at a superficial level, and I would suspect something like an AI had written this for something like that. The third criticism they give, critical theorists might argue that a hermeneutical approach can be too passive, simply accepting the meaning of text at face value rather than actively seeking to challenge and critique it. Well, again, that's a standard kind of critique you'd find in intro texts. In fact, that one very much has been addressed, and there are a lot of approaches to hermeneutics that are far more engaged politically and in many other ways than that would suggest. In other words, hermeneutics is not necessarily just about a passive reading of something. And so what I'm trying to say here is that this is a pretty good superficial level answer. But even at an undergraduate level, I would expect something more from this, if I was to ask that question. But here's the thing. If you've ever been in any of my classes before, you will know that my focus tends to not be on the answers that people give, but on the questions they ask. Ultimately, what I want people to be able to do is ask a good question. And so that's a very involved process. People have to go through iterations of questions, because the first thing you think of is often, might have a kind of gut level appeal to you, but it's not necessarily a very good question yet, right? There's a lot of things to be considered still. There's a lot of, definitions perhaps that need to be made, assumptions. What does this question assume? What disciplinary sources or methods need to be drawn on in order to answer this question? How would it look different if we had it in a different disciplinary space of some sort? Sometimes questions transport over these borders. And so, if you focus on the questions, as I try and do in classes, rather than focusing on the answers, that puts this whole thing at a different kind of level. So let me show you another example here. I went from there to ask another question. What are the best questions a feminist might raise concerning COVID-19 misinformation? Okay, so again, the answers that we get here for this one are kind of short, to the point. They are not bad answers, but again, pretty superficial answers. So, one thing that I would encourage somebody to do if they are asking a question in this general domain is to get specific. And the AI can deal with specificity. And so instead, for example, of what questions a feminist might raise, we might say, what questions might Lorraine Code raise? She's not all feminist, she's a specific person. And so the AI could deal with that kind of thing and would probably draw on her published research to answer that. And so the point is that when I ask a question like this, it gives the evidence, actually this is the question, here we go, it gives the evidence of a question that's not very well thought through yet. And how do we know that? Because the answer we got is particularly vague, okay? Not just any feminist, what feminist? Not just any COVID-19 misinformation, what specific, aspect? The more specific you can get, the better. And this is one of the kind of constructive or positive uses I could see of using ChatGPT, and one that I would actually encourage you to try yourself, which is use it as a sounding board for the kinds of questions that you can ask. So that when you see a question, that you ask like this, and then you get the kinds of answers that we get here, evaluate those answers. Like, ask yourself, are those really good answers? Or do they leave you, wishing for a little bit more? And if they do, maybe you need to reword the question that you're asking. What I'm not interested in is, you kind of nailing the question down well enough that you can just kind of put it in, get ChatGPT to answer it, cut and paste it out, and there's your paper, right? For one thing, the answers given here are generally too short. Even with a very specific question, they don't really get into the literature well enough to, be a university level paper. But this can be a really pretty useful research tool and a thinking tool, right? And so that's what I would love to see people use this for, right? Not to try and, do an end run around thinking yourself, but to hone your own thinking, to help your own thinking be more specific, be better, ask better questions, all of those sorts of things. If you're going to use it for that, that is a really good kind of outcome of something like this. So here's another question I asked. Which theorists are most useful in a course on text and technology? Again, very vague question. I'm not at all clear that the AI understood that text and technology is a program at UCF, but look at the theorists that they gave. Pretty much part of our core reading list. I mean, all of them, really. Marshall McLuhan, Walter Ong, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Donna Haraway, Catherine Hales, and mentions a few others at the bottom that are a little bit, further afield, but still not a bad answer and not bad brief reasons for why they might be important, right? Again, this program, this AI, does not necessarily understand the kind of sub areas of our program. It does not understand the ways in which really delving into, let's say, digital humanities or digital media or digital rhetoric or whatever, involves a certain kind of more focused methodology, let's say, or more focused set of theorists. It's a start. Okay, it's not a bad start, but I think it's another evidence of the fact that if you ask a vague question, you get a pretty vague answer. Okay. So finally, I asked one more question. What's the most constructive use of ChatGPT in a humanities graduate course? Okay. And so it gives me the little blurb on what ChatGPT is, and then it gives some actually pretty good suggestions for how this might be used fruitfully to help you develop your own thinking, right? This is something that we do in classroom all the time. This is something that we've seen as useful within a classroom. But this is now another tool that can be used, and you can just use it yourself. I mean, what I often recommend that people do is to, put a perspective question for, let's say, a final paper, in a document, and then just start playing with it, right? Just start changing words, start defining things, start making connections to specific theorists, start, specific texts, all of those kinds of things, just so you can refine the question as closely as possible and get it in your gut. I mean, so that you feel it, so that, you feel like this question really matters, and I really know what it is, and I really know how to, answer it, because I've spent enough time with it that I understand what it's going to take, what steps have to be taken in order to answer that question. And so the suggestions that the AI gives here are quite good. So what are they? Well, number one, use it as a tool for text generation and analysis. Could be used to generate text based on specific prompts. Students could then analyze and interpret in relation to course concepts and themes. So fair enough. As a way to explore language and meaning, use it to generate text based on different inputs and compare the results, comparing how the model's predictions reflect different aspects of language and meaning. So, that's one thing you could do there is use some theorists of this course to reflect on other theorists in this course. right? Instead of seeing theory as just one big, huge thing, recognize that the reason there are a lot of theoretical approaches is that there's a lot of different opinions on how to frame the world, how to make sense out of the world. And, these naturally come with critiques of others. And so you could use ChatGPT to start generating that. You could also, by the way, go to the library, and you could also use Google Scholar, and you could also do other things. This is just another tool you have available at this point. So number 3, as a way to practice close reading and interpretation, use ChatGPT to generate a text and then analyze it in detail, considering its structures, themes, and language. So, you could, in tandem with writing up your prospectus for this course, just start putting in some elements of your prospectus, especially in question form, and see what this gives you back. See if it's adequate. See if it suggests a path towards a kind of robust answer, because that's ultimately what you want to be able to do with this. And then finally, it's suggested as a tool for creative writing or writing exercises, giving prompts, and so forth. And so that's, I can see that's useful, probably less of use in the kinds of courses I teach, but still possibly very useful. And so what we have here is, I'm regarding this as a really useful tool. I'm going to put something in the fine print document in the syllabus about, this could be used as a form of plagiarism. But I hope that students see the possible benefits for their own development of thinking in this, rather than seeing it as just another way to cheat, right? Like I said at the beginning, technology comes along all the time and forces us to rethink how we engage a classroom, how we develop knowledge, not just communicate it, but develop it together, right? Because ultimately the best classrooms are ones in which we think together, not where, the professor simply downloads information and everyone else absorbs it, right? The best thing we can do is think together, and that we all learn and grow from it. And so, this is another actor within that space, one that even a couple of years ago we perhaps knew might have been on the horizon, but most of us were able to just say, well, it's not at that point yet, the tech isn't there yet. Well, now it's here, okay? And it's only going to get better. And so I think if we can make it so that this is our friend and not an enemy, I think it can be a really useful and powerful component of our learning. So that's my little spiel on ChatGPT and on AI in general in classrooms. And I hope you take it to heart, and I hope you use this, and I hope you use it well and carefully, and don't fall for the idea that whatever it generates is somehow as good as or better than your own thinking, because it's not, right? Your own thinking still matters, and that's what we're here to develop. So, all right, there we have it.